You are listening to the Silent Archive. In the margins of Chronicles, beneath layers of ash and silence, lie stories the world was never meant to remember. Tonight, we descend into one of them where a single light once split the darkness of 7th century Britain and vanished without a trace. This is not myth. This is not legend. This is history recovered. There are instances from the distant past that evoke the feeling of a page being forcefully torn from a book, leaving behind a narrative with a sudden, unexplainable void. For centuries, historians have gazed into such an abyss of time in the 6th century, when civilization appeared to falter, records became scarce, and tales of desolate wastelands and dormant monarchs began to emerge. Writings from places as far-flung as Constantinople and Ireland described a mysterious fog that dimmed the sun, ushering in an era marked by bitter cold, failed crops, and deep despair. People understood that the sun had let them down, but they could not comprehend the reasons behind its failure. For over a millennium and a half, the cause remained elusive, a chilling historical enigma of a world that nearly came to an end, not with an explosive finale, but through a prolonged, quiet decline. In this narrative, we will reconstruct the tale of that calamity, concentrating on its significant, transformative, and largely overlooked effects on the island of Britain. We will examine how the worst year to be alive in human history influenced the very foundations of what would eventually become England, Wales, and Scotland. Before we delve into the disaster, let's consider the fragile world that existed just prior. It was a time blissfully unaware of the silent catastrophe approaching, perhaps from the cosmos or rumbling deep within the earth. Let us journey back to the year 585 AD, to the island of Britain, a land that had transitioned from being the Roman province of Britannia to a collection of kingdoms not yet recognized in later history. This was a land of echoes and remnants, a fractured mosaic of cultures and peoples living among the fading splendor of a fallen empire. For over a century, the Roman legions and administrators had departed, called back to defend a crumbling heartland. The grand project of Britannia, with its heated villas, stone roads, and unified laws, had crumbled, yet its memory lingered in the soil of the west and north, in the rugged hills of what would become Wales, the lowlands of Scotland, and the Cornish peninsula, where the Romano-British continued to exist. These were the descendants of Celtic Britons who had embraced Roman ways. They spoke a Brittonic language, a precursor to Welsh and Cornish, but still incorporated Latin into their speech and sometimes donned togas for ceremonial purposes, yearning for the legitimacy and power that the name of Rome once conferred. They were Christians, a faith that had taken root and survived the empire's collapse, with small monasteries serving as centers of learning and stability in a fractured landscape. Their kingdoms were small and fiercely independent, such as Gwynedd, Powys, and Damonia, each ruled by a king who might style himself as Rex or even emulate a Roman commander. Among the most powerful was Maelwyn of Gwynedd, a formidable figure condemned by the monk guilders as the dragon of the island. He ruled from a hill fort overlooking the Irish Sea, surrounded by poets and fierce warriors, embodying the old Celtic warrior ethos. Despite being a Christian king, men like him held authority in this land, projecting power through the strength of their war bands. With wealth measured in cattle and loyalty, they fought amongst themselves just as much as they battled external foes, existing in a world defined by shifting alliances and bitter rivalries, all under the shadow of the crumbling Roman infrastructure they had inherited. Picture a farmer tilling a field near an abandoned villa, its mosaic floors cracked by frost, its roof missing, yet its stone walls still providing shelter for his sheep. He might look up to see the straight line of a Roman road stretching across the horizon, the best route to the next market. Though its surface was weathered and potholed, it served not imperial commerce but local necessity. This was the reality of Western Britain, a society striving to maintain a complex Romanized identity, without the imperial structure that had once made it possible. They clung to the past, while in the east, a different future was taking shape. Along the Saxon shore from Kent to East Anglia, the settlements of the Anglo-Saxons were emerging. These were descendants of Germanic tribes Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who had begun arriving generations earlier. Initially, they came as Roman mercenaries, then as raiders, and eventually as settlers and conquerors. Their world was starkly different, characterized by a guttural Germanic tongue, a pantheon of gods like Woden and Thor, and timber halls rather than stone and mortar. Their society revolved around clans and war bands, with art expressed in intricate metalwork and wood carvings. The nature of their arrival remains a historical puzzle. Was it a vast, violent migration that displaced the native Britons, or a more subtle elite takeover where a small number of well-armed Germanic warriors imposed their rule, leading the local Britons to adopt the language and customs of their new overlords? Archaeology struggles to provide a definitive answer. Burials show both cultures coexisting in some areas, while in others, a clear cultural break is evident. The reality was likely a messy combination of violence, coexistence, assimilation, and resistance. By 535 AD, this process was well underway, with the East becoming a foreign land within the island. The tension between the Brittonic West and the Germanic East defined the political dynamics of the era's slow conflict, characterized by contested frontiers and seasonal raids, fragile truces, and simmering resentments. To those living through it, it felt like the eternal state of affairs, with no inkling that the very sky was about to collapse, rendering their squabbles and ambitions utterly insignificant. As 535 bled into the new year, the familiar rhythm of short cold days and long dark nights persisted. Across the island, people huddled in their homes, the scent of wood smoke and damp wool filling the air as they awaited the slow return of light. The winter solstice passed, and as January gave way to February and then March, a collective anticipation for spring began to rise. Encoded in the very bones of those who lived by the seasons, they watched for signs: the first buds on the blackthorn, the return of migratory birds, the day when the sun's warmth could finally be felt through heavy cloaks. But in 536, the signs were wrong. Birds were late or absent altogether. Buds remained tight against an unyielding chill, and the sun itself began to change. Initially, it was subtle enough to dismiss as a patch of high, thin cloud, but soon it became undeniable. The sun rose not as a brilliant orb, but as a pale disk, scarcely brighter than a full moon. Chroniclers across the known world, who would never meet or read each other's work, all reached for the same symbol. The sun had taken on the color of the moon, its light a pale imitation of its former glory. In Italy, a higher-ranking official named Cassiodorus wrote of a sky the color of ash, a sun that had lost its heat, and the profound strangeness of standing under the midday sky without casting a shadow. The world felt flat, a two-dimensional drawing of itself. For the people of Britain, this celestial malaise was terrifying. Their lives depended on the sun it dictated when they planted crops, moved livestock, traveled, and sought shelter. Its weakening was not merely a meteorological oddity, it was a cosmic rupture. In the Brittonic kingdoms of the West, Christian priests would have sought answers in their holy texts, perhaps interpreting the dim sun as a sign of the end times, a fulfillment of grim prophecies. Prayers intensified in small stone churches and remote monastic cells, a desperate appeal to a god who seemed to have turned away. For the pagan Anglo-Saxons in the East, interpretations varied, but were equally dreadful. Their mythology spoke of a time known as the Fimbulwinter, a prolonged winter that would precede Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods. What they were witnessing, though they could not have known, was the result of an immense amount of dust and sulfate aerosols blasted high into the stratosphere, forming a persistent veil that shrouded much of the northern hemisphere. This atmospheric shield reflected sunlight back into space before it could warm the Earth. The prevailing theory suggests a volcanic eruption of unprecedented scale. Evidence from ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica indicates a massive spike in sulfate deposits, dated to this period, with candidates ranging from Iceland to North America. A leading contender is the Ilongo volcano, in present-day El Salvador, dated to around 536. The sheer force of such an eruption. Alternatively, some researchers point to evidence of cosmic dust and nickel deposits in the ice cores, suggesting an extraterrestrial impactor, perhaps a comet or a fragment of one, that either struck the Earth or disintegrated in the atmosphere. This scenario could explain the persistent dimming of the sun and subsequent cooling, possibly giving rise to legends of dragons in the sky, folk memories of a comet's terrifying passage. Before the long darkness fell, back in Britain, the people were consumed by the effects. As April turned to May, the month that should have brought life and warmth, the cold deepened. Days stretched into monotonous twilight, with night shrouded in an inky blackness. The moon and stars obscured. A profound silence descended, the usual sounds of the countryside muted, animals confused and hunkered down. The atmosphere felt stifled, trapped beneath a low, oppressive ceiling. With the cold came not just morning frost but hard, killing frosts that lingered into June and July. The delicate shoots of new crops, barley and wheat, the lifeblood of these communities, withered in the fields. Trees failed to grow leaves, and summer pastures turned barren, leaving livestock weak and thin. The realization dawned on all from kings to farmers that this was not a fleeting event. The sun was not returning, summer had been cancelled entirely. The very engine of life had stalled, and they were passengers in a world grinding to a halt. The grim acknowledgement that summer was not simply delayed, but had been entirely cancelled, settled over Britain like a second internal winter. The rhythms of agriculture, an ancient cycle woven into the fabric of language and belief, had been shattered. June, typically a month of long days and burgeoning growth, was instead a landscape of grey skies and shivering leaves. July, which should have brought the scent of hay and the buzz of bees, was cold and silent, with frosts biting deep into the soil at night. Crops that should have been heavy and golden stood thin and greenish-grey, yielding only shriveled seeds that would never ripen. The oats, a staple in the cooler, wetter parts of the island, failed entirely. Harvesting in late August and September became a ritual of grief, no joy, no celebratory feast, only the grim task of gathering a crop barely worth the effort. The yield was a fraction of what it should have been, fit only for starving animals, soon to be the only food for starving people. The wild harvest was equally dismal. Hazel trees bore no nuts, brambles yielded only a few sour berries, and acorns, crucial for pigs, were sparse and blighted. The natural bounty, which always supplemented cultivated grains, was nearly non-existent. Life became a relentless calculation of scarcity, with meager harvests divided between immediate consumption and what had to be saved for seeds. A desperate gamble that there would even be a next year to plant. Chroniclers in nearby lands, suffering the same fate, distilled the catastrophe into two stark Latin words, periops, meaning the loss of bread. This simple phrase encapsulated a consuming reality. Bread was not merely sustenance, it was the foundation of existence, the product of a year's labor, the literal and metaphorical staff of life. To lose it was to lose everything. The trees themselves recorded the disaster silently. In the future, scientists studying ancient oaks preserved in peat bogs would discover the year 536 marked by a ring so thin it was nearly invisible, a dark line signifying a year when the conditions for growth vanished. The trees conserved their energy, waiting for the sun's return, just as the people did. The cold was a constant, intimate enemy, not the crisp, dry cold of a healthy winter, but a damp chill that clung to clothes, seeped through walls, and settled deep in bones. The demand for firewood became voracious. Families spent every waking hour, when not in the fields, scouring woodlands for anything that would burn. Smoke from their hearths hung thick under the oppressive grey sky. 100 small sick. Yet as the year dragged on, accessible wood became scarce, forcing people deeper into dark, silent forests. Hunger began as a dull, persistent ache, a hollow that never quite filled. The grain from the previous year's harvest, a bumper crop by some accounts, was what staved off immediate collapse. But every family, village, and king knew that reserve was finite. Portions were cut 1 meal a day became the norm. Boiled grains and whatever edible roots could be foraged from the hardened soil. The effect was insidious. People grew weary, their movements slow and deliberate, minds clouded by lethargy. Children, usually filled with energy, became quiet and listless. The elderly and sick were the first to fade, their weakened bodies unable to withstand the combined assault of cold and malnutrition. The psychological toll was immense. Living for months under a sky that never brightened in a world without shadows was profoundly disorienting. The sun, the ultimate source of life, had abandoned them. In the Christian West, sermons were filled with fire and brimstone, with blame placed squarely on the sins of the people. Kings like Maelwyn, already accused of wicked deeds, were seen as the source of divine wrath, their legitimacy crumbling with each passing sunless day. The populace flocked to churches, praying for intervention that never came. In the pagan East, the Anglo-Saxons made desperate sacrifices to their gods, perhaps even human ones, pleading for wisdom and reprieve from the endless winter. But the sky remained stubbornly grey and silent as the first winds of a brutal winter began to blow. The social fabric, stretched tight by fear and hunger, began to tear. The instinct for self-preservation overwhelmed communal bonds. A family with a small surplus of grain would hide it from starving neighbors rather than share. The historiographic mystery lies in how different societies managed this strain. The hierarchical Romano-British kingdoms, with their memories of Roman administration, may have attempted organized rationing from central storehouses, but such systems are only as strong as the food supply. When it runs out, authority evaporates. Conversely, the more kin-based Anglo-Saxon communities might have held together longer on a local level, with clans protecting their own. But this could have led to immediate and violent conflicts over scarce resources. The year of twilight was ending, and true darkness was about to descend. As the meager stores dwindled, the long cold night of a real winter descended upon a weakened, starving populace. The first winter of the long twilight was a season of profound silence. Starving communities huddled around dwindling fires, noticing that the world outside had fallen unnaturally quiet. The familiar sounds of the wild faded away. Winter birds were absent, and the howling of wolves grew sporadic, then ceased altogether. This was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping landscape, but the hollow silence of a world actively dying. The catastrophe that began in the sky seeped deep into the soil, poisoning the wellsprings of life and triggering a catastrophic collapse of the island's ecosystem. Nature, unable to cry out in pain, expressed its agony through this all-encompassing stillness. The foundation of any ecosystem is the energy received from the sun, a simple truth that became a brutal lesson for the 6th century natural world. With sunlight reduced to a pale glimmer, photosynthesis, the miraculous process that transforms light into life, stuttered and stalled. Plants, the producers at the base of the food chain, were the first to suffer. Trees that should have produced thick green canopies in the failed summer managed only sparse, sickly foliage that grasses in meadows and on hillsides were thin and blighted. Wildflowers that provided nectar for insects failed to bloom. This was not just a failed harvest for humanity, it was a failed harvest for every living creature. Microscopic evidence of this floral catastrophe remains preserved in deep layers of peat bogs and lake beds. Pollen analysis reveals a stark line in sediment corresponding to the mid-6th century. Below it, a diverse landscape of oak, ash, and elm existed alongside cultivated grains. Above it, this diversity vanished, replaced by a surge of hardy scrubland plants and weeds, a clear signature of deforestation and agricultural collapse. This botanical disaster triggered a devastating chain reaction, a process scientists now refer to as a trophic cascade. Herbivores, the plant eaters on the next rung of the food chain, found their world devoid of sustenance. Herds of red and roe deer, which once roamed the extensive forests, discovered little to browse. Their ribs began to show, their coats grew ragged, and they became too weak to endure the relentless cold. Wild boars, reliant on acorns and roots, starved en masse. Rabbits and hares, creatures of grassy verges, vanished entirely. The effect on livestock was equally severe. The desperate slaughter of domestic animals that began in the autumn of 536 was not merely about needing meat, it was an act of grim mercy. The animals were starving, and there was no fodder to sustain them through the winter. Archaeological sites from this period often contain mass graves of cattle, their bones showing signs of malnutrition, a testament to this island-wide cull. With herbivores gone, the predators that depended on them faced a death sentence. Wolves, cunning foxes, and elusive lynxes found their prey disappeared. These hunters grew desperate, likely encroaching into human territory more than ever before. Driven by an all-consuming hunger, a lone starving wolf at the edge of a village would have been a terrifying omen, embodying the hunger and disorder that now surrounded them. Even the skies grew empty. Great eagles and red kites that soared on thermals found no prey below. Smaller birds, from owls hunting mice to songbirds feeding on insects and seeds, found their ladders bare, their nesting seasons failures. The vibrant bird song that should have returned with the ghost of a spring in 537 was but a pale echo of its former self. The devastation was not confined to the land, rivers and lakes. Despite appearing, the lack of insects that fed on this growth died off, and in turn, the fish that consumed the insects began to starve. The great spawning runs of salmon and trout, crucial for communities living along the rivers, dwindled or failed completely. Otters hunting in streams and herons standing sentinel on banks disappeared, either starving or moving on in search of richer waters. For the people of Britain, this ecological collapse was the final closing of a trap. In the first year, they lost their bread, the product of their own labor. Now they were losing the commons, the wild resources that had always provided a safety net in lean times. A skilled hunter was a valuable asset to any villager man who could bring back a deer or boar when grain stores were low. But now, his skills were rendered useless. He could track for days through the silent, overgrown forests and find nothing. The snares he set for rabbits remained empty. The fishing nets cast in rivers came up bare. The island, once a place of relative abundance, had become a barren prison. Every source of sustenance cultivated and wild was being systematically extinguished. There was nowhere to turn. The gnawing hunger in their bellies mirrored the vast emptiness of the landscape around them. The world held its breath, trapping the people of Britain in suffocating stillness, waiting for the end. By the winter of 537, the last of the grain hoarded from the bountiful harvest of 2 years prior was gone. It vanished grain by grain, each one counted and cherished, until the day came when storage jars and leather sacks were empty. This marked the tipping point, the moment when deep hunger tipped into mass starvation. The famine, which had loomed for a year, became a brutal, all-consuming reality. It was a foe that could not be fought with swords or shields, an invisible siege, encircling every settlement, household, and individual. The bonds that held society together, the intricate web of kinship, loyalty, and law, began to fray and snap under relentless pressure. The physical effects of starvation are cruel and unyielding. The initial gnawing hunger eventually gives way to a profound lethargy, where the body, in a desperate act of self-preservation, muscles waste away, leaving skin stretched tight over bone. Eyes sink deep into sockets. Bellies swell with the fluid of malnutrition, a grotesque parody of fullness. The immune system collapses, leaving the population vulnerable to any passing sickness. A simple cough could become a death sentence, a small cut could refuse to heal. Diseases of deficiency, like scurvy, would have become rampant, causing teeth to loosen and old scars to reopen. People would have moved like shadows through their lives, their minds consumed by a single thought: food. All other concerns, love, grief, ambition, faith, receded, becoming distant luxuries from a world that no longer existed. With this physical decay came a moral and social decay that was even more terrifying. The ancient rules of community, the unwritten contract of mutual support that allows people to coexist, were among the first casualties of famine. The concept of neighbor dissolved, replaced by the other arrival for any pitiful resources that might remain. A wisp of smoke from a nearby hut, once a comforting sign of life, now sparked suspicion and envy. Did they have hidden stores of food, a secret source of firewood? Paranoia became the new currency of social interaction. The family unit, the most fundamental bond, was tested to its breaking point. Stories from other great famines in history tell of heartbreaking choices. The elderly and sick, unable to contribute to the search for food, might be left to die. The instinct to feed one's own children would clash with the instinct for self-preservation, creating psychological torment that shattered the strongest minds. In such a world, the authority of kings and chieftains became a hollow fiction. A leader like Omen might still sit in his great hall, surrounded by the last of his loyal warriors, but his commands would be meaningless beyond the reach of his sword. He could not conjure grain from nothing, he could not command the sun to shine. His power, which rested on his ability to provide plunder, protection, and prosperity, evaporated. Any remaining law and order followed suit. Why respect a prohibition against theft when your child is starving? Why obey a chieftain who cannot feed you? The only law that remained was the law of the strong. Small groups of the healthiest remaining men would have banded together, transforming from farmers and craftsmen into desperate raiding parties. Their targets were not the fortified strongholds of rival kings, but isolated farmsteads and small villages, any place that might hold a forgotten handful of grain, a scrawny dog, or even strips of leather that could be boiled for sustenance. It was a war of all against all, fought by skeletal figures with makeshift weapons. The archaeological record for this period is famously sparse, but the evidence that does exist hints at this profound breakdown. Settlements were found abandoned, their inhabitants either starved, killed, or simply walked away in a desperate migration. Burial customs, often a society's most conservative tradition, fell apart. Orderly cemeteries were replaced by hasty, shallow graves with no ceremony, or even bodies left unburied within houses. This speaks to a society so overwhelmed by death and despair that it could no longer perform the most basic rituals for its dead. Then there is the darkest mystery of all, the final taboo of a starving society: cannibalism. While there is no definitive archaeological proof from 6th century Britain, its spectre looms over every great famine, when every animal has been consumed, every root dug from the frozen earth, every strip of leather boiled into a gelatinous broth. The descent into this ultimate act of desperation becomes a grim possibility. It represents the final collapse of human society, the point at which people cease to be people and become mere starving creatures. Britain in 538 was a land of silence, empty villages and skeletal figures haunting a dying landscape. The complex tapestry of Romano-British and Anglo-Saxon culture had been shredded. It was a world reduced to its most elemental state, a terrifyingly blank slate upon which a new, harsher society would eventually be written. The hordes had run out, the bonds had broken, and the people were left alone in the twilight, facing the horrifying question of what they were willing to do to survive in the hollowed-out world that Britain had become. The very idea of a king seemed like a half-remembered dream from another age. The great halls of Romano-British leaders, once echoing with the boasts of warriors and the songs of bards, now stood as cold, grim fortresses against a world of ghosts. For rulers like Omen, the so-called dragon of the island, the catastrophe was not just a crisis of sustenance, it was a profound crisis of legitimacy. Their entire authority was built upon a delicate and written contract with their people and warriors. The king was expected to be a figure of immense personal charisma, a victorious leader in battle who could reward his followers with plunder and land. He was also the guarantor of prosperity and order, the central pillar around which society was organized. But the sunless sky and barren earth systematically dismantled every one of these pillars, leaving the kings of Britain powerless and exposed in the gloom. How can a king lead a charge against an enemy that is everywhere and nowhere at once? How can he distribute wealth when the land itself is bankrupt? The traditional model of kingship ceased to function. The Tulu, the king's personal war band of elite, loyal warriors, was the heart of his power. These men were bound to him by oaths, but also by the expectation of reward food, drink, weapons, and status. As the king's granaries emptied and his herds vanished, his ability to provide for his most essential followers dwindled to nothing. A starving warrior is a warrior whose loyalty is brittle. The king would have been surrounded by the very men sworn to protect him, yet each was a hungry mouth to feed, a potential rival, a reminder of his impotence. The grand titles they inherited, echoing the lost authority of Rome, now seemed like bitter mockery. They were kings of empty fields and silent villages, rulers of a kingdom of the dead. Around this time, a fiery Christian monk named Gildas wrote his famous polemic on the ruin and conquest of Britain. Though notoriously difficult to date, its furious energy seems to speak directly to this age of chaos. Gildas unleashed a torrent of biblical fury upon 5 contemporary British kings, with Marwyn receiving the most venomous condemnation. He accused them of every imaginable sin, greed, cruelty, treachery, and godlessness. For Gildas, the wars of Britain, which he described as afflicted by war and ruin, were not random misfortunes but direct and righteous punishments from God for the wickedness of its leaders. It is tempting to read his work as a direct reaction to the unfolding catastrophe. He would have seen the dimmed sun and failed harvests not as natural phenomena, but as divine judgment proof that the sins of men like Marwyn had finally become intolerable to heaven. Imagine Marwyn barricaded in his ancestral stronghold, perhaps the great hill fort of Dagwy on the Welsh coast. The thick stone and earth ramparts, once a symbol of his power and ability to protect his people, now served a different purpose: to keep the starving masses out. The king and his inner circle, his family and last loyal retainers, became the final hoarders, custodians of the last reserves of food on the island. The relationship between ruler and ruled inverted horrifically. He was no longer their protector, but their jailer, and his kingdom shrank to the few acres contained within his walls. Outside those walls, his former subjects, those who had paid him tribute and fought in his name, became a skeletal, desperate mob, a silent accusation against his failure. The archaeological record supports this grim picture. Across Britain, ancient Iron Age hill forts, abandoned for centuries, show signs of reoccupation and hasty fortification during this period. It was a mass retreat to defensible ground, a splintering of society into isolated citadels of survival. The great historiographical mystery of this period is what ultimately became of this ruling class. Did these kings and their war bands starve alongside their people, their authority dissolving until they were indistinguishable from the desperate raiders they once fought? Or did some manage to adapt and survive? It is possible that the crisis acted as a brutal crucible, burning away weaker leaders and forging a new type of warlord. A survivor of this age would not be a charismatic king of a prosperous people, but a pragmatic, ruthless commander of a small, disciplined war band, ruling over a depopulated territory from a fortified camp. Their power would be based not on tradition or divine right, but on the brutal fact that they controlled the last remaining sources of food and the weapons to defend them. The semi-Romanized world of the Brittonic kings, with its baths, priests, and vague pretensions to lost imperial glory, perished in the famished darkness of the 530s. Any leader emerging from that gloom would be a product of it, a king shaped by twilight, ruling over a land of shadows, while the ancient authority of the Romano-British kings dissolved like mist. In the perpetual twilight, a different story unfolded in the eastern half of the island. This tale must be told with care, for it is not one of triumph but of grim and unexpected advantage found amid universal suffering. The Anglo-Saxon settlers, with their timber halls and scattered farmsteads, were not immune to the horrors of the age. The same sunless sky loomed over their fields, the same unnatural cold killed their livestock, and the same gnawing hunger hollowed out their communities. They succumbed to starvation and despair, just as the Britons did. Yet the very nature of their society and the catastrophic scale of the Brittonic collapse meant that the cataclysm paradoxically created a power vacuum that they were uniquely positioned to fill. For the Anglo-Saxons, the worst time to be alive in human history would inadvertently become their greatest opportunity. for expansion and eventual dominance. The key to this difference lies in their social structure. The Brittonic kingdoms of the West were hierarchical, centralized states in miniature spiders with the king at the center of the web. When that center collapsed, as it did when the king could no longer feed his warriors or command his people, the entire web disintegrated, leaving a helpless void. The Anglo-Saxons, by contrast, were more like a collection of starfish. Their society was fragmented and decentralized, organized around small, independent, and often competing king groups and chieftains. While they certainly had powerful leaders, their social fabric was less dependent on a single overarching authority. If one chieftain and his war band starved or were wiped out in a raid, it was a local disaster, but neighboring groups could continue to function. This cellular resilience, which might have been a weakness in a conventional war against a unified enemy, became a strength in an age of systemic collapse. They could absorb catastrophic losses without their entire political world ceasing to exist. This structural resilience was likely amplified by a grim demographic shift. While both populations were decimated, the Britons likely suffered more. Their society, with its memory of Roman urbanism, had a greater tendency toward densely populated centers, though not great cities, at least larger, more concentrated settlements. The Anglo-Saxons, as relative newcomers, were often a people of the rural landscape, living in smaller, more dispersed farmsteads and villages. In an age of famine and later plague, density is a death trap. Disease spreads faster, and a local food shortage cannot be mitigated by foraging in a depleted countryside. The Anglo-Saxon farmsteads, more isolated and self-contained, may have had a marginally better chance of weathering the storm. The result, after years of death, would have been a fundamental change in the demographic balance of the island. The Brittonic population was not just defeated, it was hollowed out, leaving vast tracts of fertile land empty for the first time in centuries. For the Anglo-Saxon warrior, the world that emerged from the famine would have been nearly unrecognizable and grimly suited to his worldview. His pagan faith was steeped in concepts of fate, doom, and a heroic struggle against a hostile world. The Fimbulwinter of his mythology was not just an end, but a necessary purification before the birth of a new world. They may have seen the blighted landscape not as divine punishment for their sins, as Gildas did, but as the fulfillment of a dark prophecy, a world scoured clean and ready to be remade. Their previous expansion had been a slow, arduous process of pushing against the frontiers of established Brittonic kingdoms. Now, there were no frontiers. The defenses had not been breached, they had simply vanished. Expansion was no longer a matter of conquest, but of migration into empty lands. A chieftain could lead his people over a hill and into a river valley to find untended fields and silent villages, their former inhabitants long dead. This is the great silent transformation of the latter 6th century. The period after the cataclysm is precisely when the great kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, such as Mercia in the Midlands and Wessex in the south, began to coalesce and expand in earnest. It was not a renewed wave of overseas migration that fueled this, but the consolidation of survivors, and their slow, inexorable spread into the vacuum left by the Britons. The historiographical mystery is whether cultural or technological factors played a role. Did their mix of crops, ploughing techniques, or greater emphasis on livestock offer some small advantage? We may never know. What is clear is that the event reset the chessboard of Britain. It catastrophically weakened the established power of the Romano-British, shattering their leadership, economy, and population. It then presented the newcomers, the Anglo-Saxons, with a depopulated, disordered, and undefended landscape. Their greatest victory was not won on a battlefield, but handed to them by a dying climate. In the years immediately following the Great Famine, a fragile semblance of life began to return to Britain. The atmospheric veil of dust and sulfates that had smothered the world began to thin and disperse. The sun, when it reappeared, must have seemed like a long-lost deity returning to its throne. Its light was still weak, and the climate colder and wetter than before the catastrophe. But it was enough for some grass to grow and a meager crop of oats to emerge from the soil. The survivors' skeletal, haunted figures who had endured the unimaginable were, like hardy weeds growing in once fertile fields, tenacious, deeply scarred, and clinging to life in a world that had been scoured clean. They could not have known that their ordeal was merely a prelude to a second, swifter, and more merciless reaper arriving on their shores. A new death came from the south, traveling on ships symbolizing a return to normalcy. In 541, from the port of Pelusium in Egypt, a terrifying new disease began to spread, the bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, making its catastrophic debut on the world stage. Carried by fleas residing on black rats nesting in grain ships, the plague exploded across the Mediterranean, with Justinian's resurgent empire providing the perfect network for its transmission. It moved swiftly, a silent microscopic passenger on every merchant vessel. Within a year, it reached Constantinople, killing nearly half the city's population and creating a crisis so profound that it brought the great empire to its knees. It was only a matter of time before it reached Britain. The island, though politically cut off from the continent, maintained tenuous sea links, especially along the Atlantic coast. The Brittonic kingdoms of the west, like Damnonia in Cornwall and Dyfed in Wales, still traded with Gaul and perhaps even the Mediterranean. In the early 540s, one of these ships would have brought more than its intended cargo: rats, fleas, and the plague itself quietly disembarking in the night. A small furry harbinger of a new apocalypse. From that single point of entry, it would have begun its inexorable march across the island. The population of Britain was horrifically vulnerable. The years of famine had served as a perfect dress rehearsal for a pandemic. The people's immune systems, shattered by prolonged malnutrition, had no capacity to fight off a novel and virulent pathogen. They were a field of dry kindling waiting for a spark. Furthermore, the societal collapse caused by the famine created ideal conditions for an epidemic. With no central authority, there was no possibility of a coordinated response. No way to enforce quarantines or safely dispose of the dead. The population was dislocated and demoralized, with many wandering in search of food or safety, inadvertently carrying the disease from one ghost village to another. The plague found a people with no shield and no shelter. For those who contracted it, the experience was terrifying. It began with a sudden fever and profound bone-deep ache, soon followed by delirium and confusion, culminating in the horrifying telltale sign of the disease: the buboes, agonizingly painful, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck that could grow to the size of an apple. A contemporary historian, Procopius, observed the plague ravaging Constantinople, noting that it seemed to kill with terrifying randomness, striking down the young and old, the rich and poor, without discernible pattern. Death, when it came, was swift, usually within 3 to 5 days. The speed and arbitrariness of the plague made it psychologically devastating, an invisible capricious demon from which there was no hiding. The historical mystery of the plague in Britain is tied to its name. The Welsh and Irish annals from around 547 speak of a great mortality called the chronic conal, or Bwyd Cronal, the Yellow Plague. For a long time, scholars debated its identity, suggesting everything from smallpox to relapsing fever. Most historians now believe this refers to the plague of Justinian. The yellow may have referred to jaundice accompanying the septicemic form of the disease, a final visible sign of total organ failure. The annals record this plague wiping out a generation of kings, among them Maelwyn of Gwynedd, the dragon of the island. Legend has it that he saw the plague coming in the form of a basilisk through a church keyhole, a myth encapsulating the terror of an enemy that could not be barred by doors or walls. The first scythe of famine had shattered his kingdom. The second scythe of plague returned to claim him, cutting down the last tall tree in a blighted forest. The death of a king like Maelwyn, carried away by the Yellow Plague, symbolized the death of an entire world. The first scythe of famine had cut the legs out from under the Brittonic kingdoms, and the second scythe of plague had swung back to cut down the leaders and heirs, the strong and the weak. The last lonely stalks of wheat left standing in a ruined field When the final wave of the pestilence receded, sometime in the 550s, the survivors, who emerged from their shuttered homes and remote hiding places, stepped into a world profoundly empty. The two great catastrophes, working in synergy, had not only wounded Britain, they had bled it dry, precipitating a demographic collapse so complete that it reset the course of the island's history. This was the Great Emptying. It is impossible to know the exact numbers, a testament to the chaos of the age. There were no census takers in the 6th century, no scribes keeping careful records of the dead. The scale of loss is a great historical mystery, a silence that can only be filled with informed and sobering estimations. To understand the impact, we must think of the two events as a single combined cataclysm. The famine, which raged for several years, had already claimed a significant portion of the population through starvation and related diseases, perhaps 10 to 20%. More crucially, it left the remaining populace deeply malnourished, socially fractured, and physiologically incapable of resisting the shock of a major epidemic. When the plague arrived, it struck a people with no defenses left. Historians examining the effects of the Black Death 8 centuries later on a healthy population, considering the compounding factor of the preceding famine, have suggested that the plague of Justinian could have killed a third, or even half of those who remained. When you combine the two events, the final toll is staggering. A conservative estimate places the total population decline in Britain between 536 and 560 at around 40%. Some scholars, looking at the extremity of environmental and archaeological evidence, argue for a figure closer to 60%. This is a number so large it is challenging to comprehend. It means that for every 10 people who stood on the island in 535, only 4 or 5 remained a generation later. It represents the loss of every second person one had ever known. A village of 200 souls reduced to a haunted hamlet of 80. Families were not just decimated, they were erased. Parents, children, and cousins all succumbing, leaving no one to remember their names. The social fabric was not merely torn, it was shredded into disconnected threads. This great emptying is recorded not in texts, but in the landscape itself. The most powerful evidence comes from the microscopic world of ancient pollen preserved in anaerobic layers of bogs and lake beds. The pollen record for the latter half of the 6th century tells a stark, unambiguous story. The presence of cereal pollens. In its place, the pollens of coarse grasses, bracken, and this unmistakable fingerprint of mass land abandonment indicates that fields painstakingly cleared and cultivated for centuries were now being reclaimed by the wild. A traveler journeying along the old Roman roads would have walked for days through a landscape, reverting to scrubland and forest, passing silent farmsteads with roofs caved in and village fields vanishing under a tide of green. The human footprint on the island, which had deepened over thousands of years, suddenly became faint, almost vanishing in places. The loss was not just of people but of knowledge. A society's skills and traditions are living entities, passed from person to person. When half the population dies, half the collective knowledge of that society dies with them. The master potter, who knew the secret of a particular glaze, the blacksmith with a unique technique for forging iron, the weaver who could create intricate patterns, their deaths left a void that could not be filled. The material culture of Britain in the late 6th century shows marked simplification. Pottery became cruder, metalwork less refined. The complex skills of the past were lost, replaced by a simpler, more utilitarian focus on basic survival. The same is true for the intangible world of culture. The bards and storytellers who held the entire history and genealogy of a people. For the few who survived, the world must have felt impossibly vast and quiet. They lived in a landscape haunted by the ghosts of the recent past. Every empty house and overgrown field was a reminder of lost neighbors, friends, and children. The psychological burden was immense, a mixture of trauma, grief, and perhaps a strange sense of freedom. Land, which had always been a contested resource, was now abundant. The problem was a desperate scarcity of human labor. There were not enough hands to till the fields, herd the livestock, or maintain the infrastructure of the past. The world had been turned upside down. This demographic vacuum, the profound emptying of the land, is perhaps the single most important consequence of the entire 536 event. It created the conditions for everything that followed: the collapse of the Brittonic world, the unstoppable expansion of the Anglo-Saxons, and the birth of the strange, myth-haunted landscape of the Dark Ages. A trauma that cannot be explained becomes a ghost haunting a culture for generations. For the survivors of the Great Emptying, the world had been fundamentally broken and remade, yet they possessed none of the scientific language we have today to understand what had happened. They could not articulate stratospheric aerosol veils, global temperature anomalies, or the epidemiology of Yersinia pestis. So, to make sense of the senseless, to give shape to the formless horror they had endured, they did what all humans do: they told stories. In the quiet, half-empty halls of the late 6th century, new myths were born, and old ones reshaped, their narratives infused with the trauma of a sunless sky, a barren earth, and a pestilence that walked in darkness. These were not mere fairy tales told for entertainment. They encoded the memory of the event into the very soul of their culture, creating the dark mythic landscape we now associate with the Arthurian Age. Perhaps the most powerful and persistent of these echoes is the legend of the wasteland. In later Arthurian romances, written centuries after our period, a recurring theme is that of a blighted kingdom, a land where crops have failed, animals have died, and people are sick and despairing. The land's affliction is mystically linked to the health of its king, the Fisher King, who suffers from a grievous wound that will not heal. The kingdom cannot recover until the king is healed, an act achievable only by a hero pure enough to quest for the Holy Grail. For generations, this was seen as a beautiful literary invention, a Christian allegory of sin and redemption. But what if its roots run deeper? What if the wasteland is not an invention, but a memory of folk memory passed down through generations of storytellers about a time when the land was truly blighted, when fields lay barren for years, and the impotent, wounded king symbolizes rulers like Iona, utterly powerless to stop their people's suffering, their authority shattered, their kingdoms collapsing around them. The myth transforms a historical reality of failed climate and failed leadership into a powerful supernatural narrative. Then there are the dragons. The word dragon is woven deep into the fabric of Brittonic identity. The Welsh call their national flag Wydreigog, the red dragon. Great leaders were bestowed the title Pendragon, or Chief Dragon, a title famously held by Arthur's own father, Uther. Why this specific obsession? Let us revisit the theory that the initial catastrophe of 536 was caused not by a volcano, but by a disintegrating comet in the Earth's atmosphere. Imagine the sight: a terrifying, fiery, serpent-like shape blazing across the sky day after day, perhaps for weeks, before the sky turned to a permanent dusty grey. To a pre-scientific people, this would not be seen as a ball of ice and rock, but a literal dragon in the heavens, a celestial omen of profound significance. It is possible that this single terrifying event, the Great Dragon preceding the long darkness, and the dying of the world, became so seared into the collective consciousness that the dragon was forever cemented as the ultimate symbol of terrifying world-altering power, an emblem to be both feared and wielded by a great king. Out of the despair of this era, a myth of profound hope also seems to have emerged: a story of the hero under the hill. Across Britain, there are local legends about a great leader, often Arthur himself, who did not die but was taken to a magical place like Avalon, or merely sleeps in a hidden cave, surrounded by his knights, waiting for the moment of his country's direst need to ride out and save his people. This poignant myth is a perfect psychological response to the trauma of the 6th century. The people of that age had seen their leaders rendered utterly helpless. They had watched them starve or succumb to plague. The myth of the sleeping king is a refusal to accept finality. It insists that true, effective, semi-divine leadership has not been extinguished. It merely lies in abeyance, a promise born of a time when all promises were broken, a flicker of hope kindled in the deepest darkness. The great mystery: of course, is the path these stories took. The first written accounts of Arthur as a historical figure appear centuries after his supposed life. The romantic tales of the Grail and the Wasteland are even later, from the High Middle Ages. Did the French and German poets who wrote these romances invent these themes? Or were they tapping into a deep well of much older and written oral tradition Celtic folktales that carried the ghostly, mythologized memory of the 6th century cataclysm through the ages? We cannot know for sure. The trail has gone cold. But when we read of a blighted land waiting for a hero, a great dragon heralding a new age, and a perfect king sleeping until his people need him most, it is hard not to sense the faint, chilling echo of that terrible time, a time when the world was a real wasteland, when a fiery omen in the sky preceded a decade of death, and when an entire people desperately needed a hero who never came. While the trauma of the Great Emptying was woven into the mythic fabric of the island, it posed a more direct challenge to formal structures of faith. A catastrophe of this scale forces a society to confront profound theological questions. Why is this happening? Have our gods abandoned us? Are we being punished? For both the Brittonic Christians and the pagan Anglo-Saxons, the years of twilight and death were a spiritual crucible, a furnace testing their deepest beliefs, burning away old certainties, and ultimately reshaping the religious landscape of Britain for centuries to come. Faith itself was being reforged in the darkness. For the Romano-Britons, the crisis directly assaulted the foundations of their Christian worldview. They were the inheritors of Roman Christianity, a faith built on the idea of a single omnipotent and fundamentally just God. They saw themselves as the righteous defenders of civilization and the true faith against the pagan barbarians in the East. Yet they were the ones suffering the most. Their society was collapsing, their kings were dying, and their God was silent. This presented an agonizing theological problem. If God was all-powerful, he could have stopped the catastrophe. Since he did not, it meant he must have willed it to happen. A just God would only will such suffering as punishment. This reasoning led them to the grim conclusion articulated by Gilders. They were being punished for their sins. The sunless sky was a sign of God turning away from them. The famine and plague were the whips of a furious, disappointed father. This interpretation, while providing an answer, was deeply pessimistic. It fostered a belief that the worldly realm was irredeemably corrupt, and that the apocalypse was at hand. For many devout individuals, the only logical response was a radical withdrawal from this sinful world. If society was doomed, salvation could only be found in solitude, prayer, and extreme asceticism. In the decades following the catastrophe, Celtic monasticism rooted in the deserts of Egypt truly flourished. Monks sought out the most remote, inhospitable places possible, isolated islands like Skellig Michael off the Irish coast, desolate moors, and impenetrable forests to establish their communities. It was a grand spiritual retreat, an attempt to create small, pure islands of faith in a vast ocean of worldly despair. This crisis may have been the crucial catalyst that pushed the Brittonic Church towards its distinctive character, deeply pious, intellectually vibrant, but also intensely world-denying and penitential. For the Anglo-Saxons in the East, the theological problem was different but equally severe. Their pagan faith was not built on the idea of a single benevolent God, but on a pantheon of powerful, yet flawed and warlike deities. Gods like Woden, the seeker of wisdom, and Thunna, the defender of mankind against giants, were not expected to provide a perfect world. The universe, in their view, was a place of constant struggle, destined to end in the great battle of Ragnarok. The cataclysm of 536 fit almost perfectly into their mythology, as the Fimbul winter, the prophesied 3-year winter preceding the end times. This provided a narrative framework to understand the events, perhaps fostering a kind of grim, heroic fatalism. This was not punishment for their sins. It was simply their doomed fate playing out on a cosmic scale. But even for a belief system comfortable with chaos, there is a breaking point. The Fimbul winter was supposed to be followed by a grand battle, a glorious end. Instead, it was followed by sickness, decay, and a slow, grinding recovery in an emptier, colder world. The gods had not led them to a heroic final charge. They had simply failed to restore the world. The sun had been wounded, and thunder had not fixed it. The harvest had failed, and no amount of sacrifice had brought it back. Over a generation, this catastrophic failure would have created a profound crisis of confidence. The old gods, who were meant to be masters of the natural world, had been proven impotent. This would have created a spiritual vacuum, a deep-seated uncertainty at the very heart of Anglo-Saxon culture. Into this vacuum, a new story would arrive. In 587, just as the first generation born after the plague came of age, a mission from the Pope in Rome, led by a monk named Augustine, landed on the shores of Kent in Anglo-Saxon southeast Britain. The historical timing is remarkable. Augustine and his followers brought with them a faith that claimed to worship the one all-powerful God who created the entire universe, to a people whose own gods had recently failed so spectacularly to control the world. This would have been a compelling proposition. The Christian missionaries offered not only a powerful new deity, but also a coherent explanation for suffering, the promise of an eternal reward, and access to the literacy, law, and culture of the great continental civilizations for ambitious Anglo-Saxon kings, trying to build larger kingdoms from the wreckage of the old world. This was an irresistible package. The great catastrophe had not brought Christianity to their shores, but it had fatally wounded the pagan faith standing in its way, plowing the spiritual soil of England and making it ready for the seeds of the gospel. For over 1,000 years, the memory of the great catastrophe of the 6th century survived only as a collection of ghosts. It was the whisper of a sun that gave no light in a Byzantine chronicle, the stark two-word entry of a failure of bread in an Irish monastery, and the deep resonant trauma of a blighted land echoing in the myths of the wasteland. History, with its reliance on written word, could only see the faint outlines of the disaster. The cause remained a mystery, and its true scale was impossible to grasp. Yet a more precise and detailed record of the event awaited discovery, not in fragile manuscripts, but in the silent living archives of the earth itself. The physical evidence of the sunless years was preserved in the glaciers of the Arctic, and recorded in the slow, patient growth of ancient trees. It simply waited for a new kind of science. The first of these silent witnesses to break its silence was the forest. Dendrochronology, the art of reading tree rings, revealed the history written in the wood. Every year of a tree's life adds a new growth layer beneath its bark. In good years, with plenty of sunshine and rain, the ring is wide and healthy. In bad years, marked by drought or cold, the ring is narrow and constricted. By studying the overlapping patterns of rings in ancient timbers, scientists built a continuous year-by-year climate calendar stretching back for millennia. They created a library where every book is a tree, and every page is a year of sunlight and rain. In the latter half of the 20th century, scientists began to notice something strange. Researchers in Ireland analyzing ancient oaks preserved in peat bogs found a pattern of growth rings that suddenly narrowed to almost nothing, indicating a near-total growth shutdown beginning in 536 AD. This pattern appeared in trees from across Europe and North America, suggesting a global catastrophe. The crucial discovery proved that the event was not a local famine or regional climate anomaly. It was a hemispheric and likely global disaster. For over a decade, starting in 536, the trees of the world had nearly stopped growing. It was as if the entire planet held its breath, a moment of profound environmental shock. Recorded in their very substance, the trees told the story of what had happened: a sudden, prolonged, and devastating period of cold and darkness. But they couldn't explain why. For that answer, scientists traveled to the coldest places on Earth, the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. Here, snow has fallen each winter for hundreds of thousands of years, compressing into distinct layers of ice, creating a perfect frozen timeline of Earth's history. Each layer contains trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere along with dust, ash, or chemical particles that fell with the snow. By drilling deep into this ice, scientists could pull up a delicate frozen scroll, a continuous record of Earth's climate. When these ice cores were analyzed, They revealed the smoking gun in a layer of ice corresponding to the years following 536 AD. There was a massive spike in sulfate aerosols concentration that could only have come from one of two sources: a colossal volcanic eruption or a cosmic impact from a comet or asteroid. The ice confirmed the tree's testimony and provided the physical cause. There had been a massive event that threw enough material into the air to block out the sun. Suddenly, all the disparate clues clicked into place, a moment of grand scientific convergence. The historian's mysterious dim sun, the archaeologist's broken trade routes, the botanist's record of abandoned fields, the dendrochronologist's starving trees, and the glaciologist's layer of acid in the ice all told the same story. This powerful multidisciplinary wave of evidence led the medieval historian Michael McCormick in 2018 to declare that 536 had marked one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. In a way, this scientific process is a form of time travel. It allows us to give a name and reason to the suffering of people who died without understanding. We can now stand with a 6th century farmer, look up at the same dim sky he saw, and understand the volcanic particles causing it. The rediscovery of this lost cataclysm is a profound testament to the power of science in reassembling a forgotten past. The story was never truly gone. It was written in the wood of forests and the layers of ice, a silent history of the planet, waiting patiently for us to learn its language. Science solved a great cold case, proving that the catastrophe of the 6th century was a real, datable, and global event. But solving one mystery often opens the door to another, more specific one. Investigators knew a crime had been committed against the global climate, but the identity of the culprit remained a matter of intense debate. This is a cosmic detective story with two prime suspects. Was the agent of the long twilight a colossal volcanic eruption that choked the sky with ash and gas from below? Or was it a visitor from the void, a cosmic collision with a comet or asteroid that shrouded the world in dust from above? The search for the ultimate cause is a journey into the heart of the Earth and the farthest reaches of the solar system. The leading suspect, for which evidence is strongest, is the volcano. When scientists examined the chemical signature left in Greenland's ice cores, they found a near-perfect match for a massive volcanic event. The key evidence is the vast quantity of sulfate aerosols, tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, exceptionally effective at reflecting sunlight. This is the classic fingerprint of a very large explosive eruption, powerful enough to blast its plume high into the stratosphere, where particles can persist for years and spread globally. The ice also contained tiny shards of volcanic glass tephra that act like geological DNA samples, allowing scientists to trace the eruption back to its source. For a long time, the specific location of this supervolcano remained a mystery, with candidates proposed from the tropics to high latitudes. Recently, a consensus has formed around a series of major eruptions in the northern hemisphere. Detailed chemical analysis of the tephra from the 536 layer in the ice points strongly toward a large eruption in Iceland. Furthermore, the ice cores show this was not a single event. A second massive sulfate spike appears in the ice around 540, also indicating an Icelandic source. This suggests the world was hit by a brutal one-to-punch, a massive eruption in 536 that initiated the cooling, followed by another in 540 that prolonged and deepened the crisis, preventing any swift recovery. Yet, there is another unsettling possibility, a theory that speaks to deeper fears. Some scientists argue that the culprit was not of this world at all. This is the case for the comet. Proponents of this theory point to clues in the ice cores, alongside volcanic sulfates. Some researchers have found elevated levels of nickel and dust with an extraterrestrial signature, possible traces of a cosmic impactor. One compelling piece of evidence is the discovery of microscopic fossils of marine life creatures that typically live only in warm, deep ocean waters, somehow blasted up and deposited in Greenland's ice at this time. This could only happen if a large object, like a fragment of a comet, struck the ocean, vaporizing a huge column of seawater and throwing it, along with dust and deep sea life, into the upper atmosphere. This theory gains weight from the fact that a bright comet, thought to be Halley's Comet, was recorded by chroniclers in 530, just 6 years before the disaster. Perhaps in 536, Earth passed through a dense trail of debris left by this comet, triggering an impact or a series of atmospheric airbursts. This theory resonates with persistent myths of fiery dragons in the sky, a possible folk memory of a terrifying celestial event. So, who was the culprit? The scientific jury is still deliberating, though most evidence currently points toward Icelandic volcanoes. Perhaps the question itself is based on a false choice. The answer may not be either, or but both. The mid-6th century may have been a time of perfect storm, a terrible convergence of terrestrial and cosmic misfortune. A major volcanic eruption in 536, followed by another in 540, perhaps compounded by a cometary fragment impact in the same period. This cascade of events would explain the profound and long-lasting nature of the crisis. Whether the ultimate cause was fire from below or above, the result for the people of Britain was the same: a world plunged into disorienting twilight, a strange and terrifying darkness that severed the last links to the ancient world and set the stage for the medieval age. In this bewildering twilight of the 6th century, this murky borderland between forgotten history and remembered myth, we must search for the origins of Britain's most potent and enduring legend, the story of King Arthur. He is a ghost haunting the island's imagination, a king of summer and chivalry, master of a shining court called Camelot. Yet, for all his literary fame, he is a phantom in the historical record. The great fundamental problem of Arthur is that the very sources written during his supposed lifetime, like Gildas's furious sermon, never mention his name. He appears as if from mist in chronicles written centuries later. But if a leader of that name, or one who inspired the legend, existed, he would have lived, fought, and ruled directly in the shadow of the great cataclysm. By viewing the legend through the lens of this dark reality, we can perhaps glimpse the shadowy origins of Camelot and the tragic historical truth upon which the romance was built. Let us set aside the shining armor and tapestry-hung walls of storybook Camelot. Imagine instead a historical leader in Britain of the 530s, not a king in the traditional sense, ruling a stable kingdom from a magnificent court, but a warlord, a dux bellorum, or leader of battles, as the earliest sources call him. His court would have been a windswept, heavily fortified hilltop, his Knights of the Round Table a personal war band of hungry, desperate warriors. His primary enemy would not have been a rival king, or a Saxon invader in a straightforward war of conquest, but chaos itself. His great struggle would have been the day-to-day fight against starvation, the effort to hold a fragmenting society together, and the battle against the profound despair of a world seemingly ending. In this context, his legendary 12 great battles against the Saxons, culminating in the decisive victory at Mount Bodon, take on new light. Perhaps these were not grand campaigns of national liberation, but desperate defensive actions to protect the last pockets of food and order from starving raiders, both Saxon and Briton. A victory at Mount Bodon may have been less about pushing back a frontier and more about securing a grain harvest or a herd of cattle, an event so significant it would be remembered and embellished for generations. The historical Arthur, if he existed, was not a king of a golden age, but a crisis leader, preeminent warlord, whose success was measured not in territory conquered, but in the number of his people who survived the winter. The central myths of the Arthurian world resonate with this grim reality. The wasteland, the blighted kingdom that can only be healed by the Holy Grail, can now be seen not just as a folk memory, but as the central mission of a historical Arthur. The Grail quest of his war band would have been a desperate search for a way to restore the land, a hunt for hidden caches of seed grain, for valleys untouched by the blight, for anything that could bring life back to the dying soil. What of Arthur's end? The legend tells of the Battle of Camelot, a tragic civil war in which Arthur is mortally wounded and his entire kingdom collapses. This story echoes the second wave of catastrophe. The historical Camelot may not have been a single battle fought with swords, but the final devastating blow of the Justinianic plague, a civil war of sorts, an enemy from within, killing indiscriminately and shattering the fragile stability a leader like Arthur might have painstakingly built. The dream of a restored Britain, a fleeting Camelot held together by a great leader, did not die on a single battlefield. It died in 1,000 homes over a decade, consumed by the invisible enemy of plague. A tragedy so profound it could only be remembered as the final battle of the hero king. This context provides a compelling framework for a historical Arthur. The crisis of 536 and its aftermath created the need for such a hero. It created a situation where a uniquely gifted warlord could rise above chaos and provide a temporary bastion of hope. The subsequent societal collapse and profound amnesia explain why the history of this man was lost, leaving behind only a more powerful and resonant legend. We may never know for certain if he was real, but if he was, Camelot was not a sunlit dream of chivalry. It was a desperate flicker of a candle in deep darkness, a brief and heroic attempt to hold back the twilight, a story all the more tragic and noble for its inevitable failure. As the tragic myth of a restored Brittonic Britain faded into twilight, a different nation built on a different language and set of gods quietly took root in the emptied lands of the East. The same catastrophe that dealt the final blow to the world of Roman Britain also, ironically, tilted the soil and planted the seeds for the world of Anglo-Saxon England. The event was the unwitting midwife, the birth of a new nation not forged in a blaze of glory, but in the long, cold, world-altering darkness. To understand the scale of this transformation, we must remember the stalemate that existed before 536. The Anglo-Saxon settlements, while powerful and disruptive, were largely contained. Their expansion was a slow, hard-fought process against a network of numerous and resilient Brittonic kingdoms that saw themselves as the rightful heirs of the island. There was nothing inevitable about eventual Saxon dominance. A traveller in 530 would have envisioned a future for Britain that was likely Celtic and Christian. But the catastrophe did not merely tip the scales, it broke them entirely. It created perfect conditions for a rapid Anglo-Saxon takeover. The event acted as a brutal accelerator, primarily by causing the systemic collapse of the Brittonic world. The famine and plague, as we have seen, hit the more numerous and densely settled Britons with disproportionate force, creating a demographic vacuum. It shattered their political structures, killing kings and warrior elites, leaving them leaderless and disorganized. It destroyed their surplus-based economy, wiping out resources needed to fund armies and maintain defenses. It broke them psychologically, fostering a deep pessimism and sense of divine abandonment, a mood perfectly captured in Gildas's despairing words. The Britons were not simply defeated in war, their entire civilization was hollowed out, leaving vast, undefended spaces where their kingdoms once stood. The Anglo-Saxons, while suffering just as terribly in absolute terms, were coincidentally better positioned to weather the systemic collapse. Their more rural, king-based, decentralized society was less brittle, it could bend without breaking entirely. Crucially, their warrior culture, centered on absolute loyalty to chieftains, was perfectly adapted to the brutal age of warlords that followed the collapse. They did not need to change, they were already living it. For the Anglo-Saxon survivors, the depopulated landscape of the Midlands and South represented an unprecedented opportunity. A blank slate. They could expand their settlements and control, not by fighting costly battles, but often by moving into empty lands, claiming river valleys where former inhabitants were long dead. In the decades after the Great Catastrophe, particularly from around 560 onwards, we see this process crystallize. The most ruthless and successful Anglo-Saxon warlords began consolidating power, conquering or absorbing their weaker neighbors, both Saxon and Briton, and forging their small personal territories into larger, more stable political units. These are the beginnings of the great kingdoms of the Heptarchy: Wessex in the south, Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria in the north, and the smaller kingdoms of the eastern and southern coasts. These were new entities built on a purely Germanic model of kingship, with no connection to the old Roman past. The sheer speed and completeness of this transformation is the great mystery of this period. The written sources are so sparse that the process is nearly invisible to us. We see a Britain that is largely Brittonic in 530 and largely Anglo-Saxon by 600. The catastrophe provides the most logical context for this silent, rapid takeover. It was a conquest that happened in a graveyard, a quiet, creeping expansion that left few records because there were often no great armies to fight, and few witnesses left to tell the tale. The foundations of England were not laid by a grand invasion but were quietly set, farm by farm and valley by valley, in the silent, emptied earth of post-catastrophe Britain. The great twilight of the 6th century was the crucible in which the nations of the British Isles were violently reforged. It was a story of endings, the end of the Roman dream, the end of the Brittonic lands, the end of countless communities and traditions. Yet, as we draw our long story to a close, let us shift our gaze one last time away from the grand sweep of rising kingdoms and fading peoples, and back to the quiet, human heart of the matter. For the most profound story of this age is not about what was lost but about what, against all odds, managed to endure. It is a story of the quiet, stubborn, and remarkable resilience of life in the face of a long and seemingly endless night. For every warlord who built a fortress, for every king who died of the plague, there were 1,000 anonymous individuals whose names are lost to history, yet whose survival was the thread from which the future was woven. These are the true heroes of the age, not the battlefield champions, but those who endured quietly and desperately. It was the courage of a parent foraging in frozen woods for one more day to feed a child, the strength of a farmer, after years of failed harvests, saving a handful of seed grain, believing in a spring that might never come. It was the profound instinct of communities to band together, to share warmth around a single fire, and to defend their last resources from encroaching darkness. It is easy to chart the course of collapse, but it is in these small, unrecorded acts of hope and defiance that a society's heart continues to beat. The world that these survivors began to rebuild was smaller, quieter, and simpler. The interconnected world of the past was gone. Life centered on the local, the tangible, the immediate, a world of small, self-sufficient communities often clustered around. They learned to live in their new, wilder landscape, becoming hunters as well as farmers. Their lives once more intimately tied to the rhythms of the resurgent natural world around them. They had to find new meanings in their altered world, creating new stories to explain their past and new social bonds to secure their future. They lived in the ruins of a greater age, but they were not a people of ruins, they were the foundations of a new one. The story of the year 536 is ultimately a humbling one. It starkly reminds us of the fragility of even the most sophisticated human societies. It shows how quickly the complex systems we rely on, agriculture, trade, political order, can be undone by a single shock from the natural world. It teaches us how climate, that vast invisible engine of our world, is the silent and often uncredited author of much of human history. The fates of kings and the destinies of nations can be decided by a handful of volcanic dust in the upper atmosphere. But if it is a story of fragility, it is also, and perhaps more importantly, a story of resilience. The long night of the 6th century eventually ended. The sun returned to its full strength. The trees, scarred but alive, began to grow again. The plague receded, and humanity, though catastrophically reduced and forever changed, began the slow, patient work of rebuilding. The survivors inherited a broken world, but they did not despair. They adapted, remembered, and endured. They became the ancestors of the world that followed, passing on not just their bloodlines but a deep unwritten story of having traversed the darkest valleys and emerged blinking into a new dawn. And so, our journey through this long-forgotten twilight comes to an end. The struggles of that distant age are over now. The people and their sorrows have turned to dust and memory. The silence of the empty fields has been filled again with the sounds of life. The chill of the sunless summer has been forgotten in the warmth of 1,000 springs that followed. All that remains is the story, a quiet echo from a world remade. It is time to let that echo fade, to allow the mists of the past to close in once more. The long night is over. It is time for you to find your own peace and quiet rest. Sleep. If this story found its way to you, it was not by accident. The past speaks only to those who listen in silence. Thank you for bearing witness to what was nearly lost. If you wish to uncover more forgotten truths, subscribe to the Silent Archive and join us in giving voice to the silenced. Until next time, stay curious and never stop listening to the quiet.